What's up, everybody? Welcome to Coding with Chaim. In this week's video, I want to talk to you about a topic called internationalization. So say, for instance, you have an app that's going to get used by people all around the world. So you'll have users in the United States, you'll have users in various countries in Europe, you'll have users in the Middle East, right? And so now you want to give them the ability to have the text written in the language that they natively speak, right? So if they speak Spanish, you want it to be in Spanish. If they speak English, you want it to be in English. If they speak French, you want it to be in French, or whatever language it is, you want them to actually have that language or the text of your app be, written in that language, right? So there's actually sort of two very important parts to this. I'm only going to be discussing the one part. So basically, the first thing that you really need to do in an instance like this is actually get your app copy translated, right? Now, for me, I actually just use Google Translate for this because I only have like 3 or 4 lines of text, so it's not really a big deal. So for me, I was able to use Google Translate. But typically, and actually we just did this at work, we actually had a lot of copy that had to get translated, so we actually used a paid service called PhraseApp. But that's not the scope of this video, that's not what I'm going to be discussing in this video. For the sake of this video and for this tutorial, I actually have starter files that you can download in the description box below that already include everything that you need. It's basically a MD Create React app, so it's essentially a React app that was bootstrapped using Create React app, and I've also included a languages folder that has 2 language files in it. It's got both English and Spanish with just 3 lines of text, which will be perfect for us to actually demonstrate how internationalization would work in a React app. So that's pretty much it for the introduction. I think we can hop right into the code. So the first thing we need to do is actually install a library called React-Intl. So we're just going to go ahead and say yarn add React-Intl. Now this is the library that's actually going to be the glue between our files, our actual translated files, and our app. And it also does a couple of other neat things as well. We're going to discuss everything that it does. So once we have it installed, so actually before we do that, I just want to quickly demonstrate these language files. You'll see here I've got this folder called languages. I've got English and I've got Spanish. It's only got 3 lines of text. They're basically key value pairs. This would be the key, of course. This is the value. And then in my code, anytime that I would want to use any particular part of the text, I basically get it based on the key. And that's something that actually ReactIntl will help us with, so we're going to get into that pretty soon. So some basic setup that has to happen if we want to start using ReactIntl. The first thing is in the index.js file, the first file that actually runs when you start up your app, basically the bootstrap of your app, we need to import the Intel provider from ReactIntl. So if you've ever used Redux, you're probably already familiar with this. The Intel provider essentially will just wrap our entire app, and then it's going to pass down any language related or locale related props to the rest of our app via context, which then the rest of our app will then get to use. And again, that's really not at all different than how the Redux provider will basically pass your store down to the rest of your app, and that's pretty much all it's doing. So in order for this to work, in our case, the Intel provider actually accepts multiple different props, but we're just going to be discussing the 2 most important ones for us right now. The first one being locale, which I'm going to discuss what that means in just a second. And then the second one is messages. So basically, the way that this works is messages will essentially be the actual text that you want to pass down to your app, right? So I have 2 JSON files, one that represents my English text, one that represents my Spanish text. So what I'll do is I'll import both of them. So I'll say import Spanish from /languages/ so it's es-mx.json. Oops. And then I'll go ahead and import my English. Import English. Oh, not spelling that right at all. From /languages/ this should be en-us.json. Okay, so now once we have that, we basically take either one of these objects. So even though they're actually coming from JSON files, but when you do an import like that, it already basically turns into an actual JavaScript object that has this exact shape. So it'll be key value pairs just like that. Now, we need to actually decide which one we're going to be passing to messages, because that's what our app is going to use to actually power the text of our app. In other words, ReactIntl will use these messages that we pass to this messages prop of the Intel provider to power the text of our app. But we have to know which one we want to use, right? So what you can actually do, at least for the first iteration, in case, we're going to get to a scenario soon where we're actually going to offer the user the ability to change languages. But for the time being, what you can actually do is you can basically get the current locale from the user by calling navigator.language. So we're going to say const locale is equal to navigator.language. And now we can have some sort of check. We can basically say if locale is equal to US or en dash US, then we can basically go ahead and say, well, let's create this variable. We're going to say let lang, right? And then we'll say lang will be equal to English. Otherwise, in this case, again, because I'm only offering two different languages, I can just have a simple if else. I can then go ahead and say lang is equal to Spanish. And now I can actually go ahead and pass that down to my messages component, and that part of the boilerplate for the Intel provider is taken care of. Now the locale part is a little bit more interesting, but I'm not going to dive into that too much right now. But basically, this same locale that we read out of the navigator.language, we basically be passing right over here. Now, all I'm going to say about this right now in terms of what it does is that there are certain things that the React-Intl library can kind of handle on its own without input from you as a developer. So it's like messages, for instance, it relies on you to pass it sort of an object that has the keys and values of what your text is, and that can be written in any language. And it really doesn't know anything about what the actual language is or what the words are. It simply knows that given this key, I'm going to spit out this particular value. And I'm going to show you how that works in just a moment. But that's pretty much what messages does. It kind of relies on you to feed it the input. Whereas locale actually allows Intel provider to do some kind of neat things all on its own. So for example, let's say you have like a date that you're going to be displaying within your app. The way that the date will be displayed, in other words, whether the month and the day and the year will all be written, or like I guess the month and the actual day of the week will be written in a certain language, that can actually get powered directly by this locale all on its own. So there's actually a component that gets exported from the React-Intl library called the formatted date, which I'm also going to demonstrate this soon, but I just kind of want to give the overview of what these props are doing. So this formatted date can actually format a date all on its own. So you basically pass it a date, and then it'll display it in the sort of correct format, and all that will get powered directly by locale, and you don't have to do anything about it. Your actual language files don't have to include anything date related, which means React-Intl can kind of do that on its own, and that's powered by this locale prop over here. So with that out of the way, now we can actually start translating. So if we come back to the app, you'll notice that right now everything is, of course, still written in English. It says edit source app.js, learn React, video brought to you by Coding with Chaim. So now I want to actually start getting this translated. Now the problem that I'm of course going to have is that given the fact that I actually live in the US, this language variable is just going to be equal to English because my locale will in fact be ENUS. So what I'm actually going to do for right now is I'm going to simply hard code in Spanish right over here just so that we can actually see things change. So let's go to the app.js component where the actual text lives. Let's start making our necessary changes to actually see the text change from English to Spanish. So first thing we need to do is we need to import a component that's exported to us from React-Intl, and this component is called formatted message. Formatted message, there we go. And I'm actually going to skip this one for just a second because this one is a little bit more complicated because it has the code tag nested within the words. So that adds a slight wrinkle, which I actually have handled, but I want to leave that for a moment. Let's first take the simplest one in our file, and that's these words here called Learn React. So, and right now, Learn React is basically just written out directly in the file. Of course, there's no translations happening here. It won't change no matter what the locale is, no matter which language you're passing in. So we need to rectify that, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and render the formatted message component, just like that. And now the formatted message component takes two all-important props. So it actually takes more, but for our purposes right now, these are the ones that we care about. The first one is the ID. This corresponds to the actual key that we're trying to render. So in this case, it'll be app.content. Grab that, and then we pass that to the ID. Now the second one, this one is also super important. This is actually called default message. The default message, you can think of this as like a fallback message in case something goes wrong. So for instance, imagine you're trying to, index into a key that doesn't actually exist in your file, like you might have misspelled it or something. Or let's imagine that you are dynamically importing files based on the user's locale, but it turns out that one of the locales from the user that's visiting your website actually isn't the language that you offer, in which case there's nothing to index into. You of course don't want your app to blow up or to not render anything at that particular line of text. You want to actually have a fallback, and that's what default message allows us to do. So if we run the app, go ahead and say yarn start, we should now see that this formatted message component here will no longer say learn React, but there we go. See, now it says aprender React. I'm sorry if I'm totally mispronouncing that. I don't speak Spanish, but the idea is that you can now see that this no longer says learn React. It's actually been translated, and that was very simple to do, right? All we have to do is render the formatted component, have this ID prop correspond to a key that we're trying to render its text, and then React-Intl will kind of handle the rest. Okay, cool. So let's take a slightly more complicated one. We're going to move on to this span down here on line 25 where it says video brought to you by Coding with Chaim. This one is a slightly more involved one only because I want to make Coding with Chaim be a variable that we pass into it. So as you can imagine, let's say, this is obviously a very contrived example because I'm forcing this to be a variable. There's really no reason for this to be a variable. But if let's say you actually have a real world scenario where you have a line of text that might say something like, hello, person, or like whatever the person's name is, and you kind of want to pass that in, right? So you obviously can't have, because at the time when you're creating these files, these JSON files, you obviously don't know what that person's name is going to be. So you might have some sort of variable, some sort of placeholder. And you can actually see that that's exactly what I did down here for app.channel.plug. If we go to the English one, you see it says video brought to you by brackets channel name. So this channel name is something that ReactIntl can now actually swap in with an actual value that you pass into it. Of course, in my case, it didn't have to be a variable, but for the sake of showing you how this is done, I did it this way, right? So the way that this works is we're once again going to go ahead and render a formatted message component. Oops. Now the formatted message component will again accept an ID argument, and so this is going to be equal to app.channel.plug. This is so far the same as it was above. We're also going to give it a default message, which is just going to be this hard-coded value right over here. And then finally, the new and all important one for the sake of variables is this values prop. The values is a prop that accepts an object as an argument, and then the keys on this are basically the variable names. So in which case I just have the one variable name, so that's going to be equal to channel name, and then I can go ahead and say coding. Whoops, that was a mistake. Coding with Chaim. Okay, so let's see that in action. And there we go. Now it says that the video is being presented by Coding with Chaim, but it's actually saying that in Spanish. I won't attempt to read that because I will probably butcher it, but you can definitely see that it's now saying that in Spanish. So let's move on to the last scenario that we have so far in this particular file, and that's the one up here that says edit, and then you can see the source app.js is actually rendered within code tags, and I want to try to actually preserve that, right? I don't want to actually lose that. I mean, we could have easily just done away with the code, but we don't want to lose that. And what's really cool is that ReactIntl actually provides you a way to deal with that as well. So what you do is in your actual file where you have your text, you basically will write the tag that you want, right? And then you will, so actually it turns out that the fact that file name in brackets, like the variable name lives between the code tags, is completely a coincidence. It doesn't actually have to be that way. It just turns out that the thing that I'm trying to put between code tags also happens to be my variable. But the most important thing to focus on this particular one is the fact that I've got the code tags written out into my strings, in my JSON strings, right? Now, we actually have to tell ReactIntl what to do when it comes across these particular code tags. So what we'll do is we're once again going to render a formatted message, and pretty much all the boilerplate that you've seen so far is going to be the same. We're going to have the ID, we're going to have the default message, and we're even going to use the values, but we're going to be passing one more thing to values. So this one I believe is app.header. Default message is going to be equal to this. And then finally, values. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. So the first one is going to be file name, which is going to be equal to source app.js. And now remember that we had this, we have this sort of code in our string, right? We have this tag code in our string, and we want to teach ReactIntl what that means. So the way that that works is we actually create a key called code, which is actually a function, which will receive an argument that is a string, right? Word, I guess we can call it. And then we're basically going to say that go ahead and render a code tag and wrap our word with it, just like that. And now if we come back here, we'll see that it's actually telling us to edit source app.js, and it's a little bit hard to tell, but you can actually tell that this is now using the code tag around the source app.js. And the way that I can actually prove that that worked a little bit easier is I can actually change this to be a strong tag so that we can see it becomes bold. And you can see how these things actually make a difference. So there you go. Now you can actually tell that it's bold. Right? So the important part here is that this has to match with the tag that you have in your actual file. This can be whatever you want, but the point is that whatever you have surrounding this word, so in other words, in this case, code, you can basically render it however you want. I could have turned that into its own H1. I could have done pretty much whatever I wanted. This is the one that matters right over here. Okay, That basically does it for the formatted message component, and this is pretty much demonstrating what the messages prop. So if you come back here to the index, we pass the messages to the actual Intel provider. So far we've dealt with everything that gets handled by the messages, but we haven't really gotten a chance to show off what the locale can actually do. So let's deal with that right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pass a date prop to my app component. Of course, this doesn't have to be passed down. I'm just doing this because I'm already here. And we're just going to make it a timestamp by using date.now, right? So now we'll come back to our app.js component, and we're going to go ahead and pull in the formatted date component. Now we'll come down here, we'll go ahead and we'll make a break tag, and then we'll render the formatted date. Okay, now the formatted date component will basically accept a couple of props. The first one, of course, is going to be the value, which is just going to be props.date, which I realize now I have not made the app component accept props, just got to add that there. So let's come back and just say props date. And now it has a couple of other props teaching it sort of how you want it to format it. Not so much in the language and pattern of, you know, whether the date comes first or the month comes first, but more just about kind of like you can think of this how you'd be formatting a date using moment. Like you might be telling it like you want to have the day in the longer version, the day in the shorter version. You might want to have like the month displayed, or you might not want to have the month displayed. You know, those kind of things. So the first thing we're going to tell is we want the year in numeric. Then we tell it we want the month in long. Then we tell it we want the day in numeric as well. And then finally we want the weekday, weekday in long. Okay, so let's go back here. And so the problem right now, of course, is that locale is going to be simply set to my locale, which is just, you know, ENUS. And so this is, of course, just going to say Thursday, January 23rd, 2020. There's nothing too exciting there. But with one simple change, again, in my files, I actually have nothing in relation to dates, the names of the days, the names of the months. I don't have any of that in my files. This is all getting handled by ReactIntl. But to really kind of show this and so that you can actually see the difference, I'll actually hard code this to now no longer be ENUS, but rather we're going to go ahead and say that this is going to be ESMX. Right, there we go. Okay, so if I now save and I come back, now you can see that it's actually telling me the date in Spanish. If I actually grab that and pop that into Google Translate, we'll see what this says. It's going to be pretty cool. We'll translate, pop it in, detect the language, translate it to Spanish, and there you go. It's actually Thursday, January 23rd, 2020. And once again, the reason why this is so cool is because it's actually getting handled all on its own by ReactIntl. My translation files don't deal with this whatsoever. Okay, so now let's deal with the scenario where we want to offer the ability to our users to actually change their locale and therefore change the language that they actually see on the app, right? Now, in order for us to do that, we have to actually build our own wrapper that's going to wrap around the entire app of ours. In other words, right now, Intel Provider is the top level wrapper that's wrapping our entire component. But in order for us to actually get the ability for us to allow the users to change language and change locale, we actually have to build our own wrapper. And the reason is because we need to be able to change the locale and this messages prop that we're passing into it. We have to kind of power that by state. The problem is that state only really sort of starts to exist as a concept once we're actually inside of our app, in the Intel Provider and in the app component. However, this particular in this particular part of the app right now in the index.js, we're kind of on top of React. We're not technically inside of React.js just yet, so therefore we don't actually have any power to deal with state and controlling values and being able to like extract the values and kind of build up this drop down that we kind of want to offer our users. So for that, what we need to do is we actually have to create our own wrapper that's going to wrap the Intel Provider. So that's going to look a little something like this. We're going to create a new component in the components folder. And now we're going to go ahead and say that we're going to have a wrapper.js. And so this is really just going to be a pretty standard React component, nothing really too fancy here. This is going to be importing from React. We are going to be using state here, so we might as well already import use state. Now we need to actually import the ReactIntl. So import, well, I guess the Intel Provider from ReactIntl, ReactIntl. Intel Provider, and let's also import both of our languages. So we're going to import actually I can grab this from index, don't have to type that again, so we'll grab both of these lines right here. Okay, so now we're also going to be building up context. I'll show you soon where the context comes into place. So we're going to call this context. Is equal to react.create context. Now let's start building the actual component. So const wrapper looks at props, because we're going to have to render props at children. Now we're going to say return. Okay, so this is where we actually get to now render the Intel provider, but here's where things are now interesting. The Intel provider now lives inside of a React component, so now we're already in React land. So now the actual props that are passed into the Intel provider, like messages and locale, can now get powered by our state. So let's just go ahead and put props at children here so that we can wrap our entire app with this. And now what we're going to say is messages and cal, but we have to first build up the state. So here we go. So we're going to say const locale and set locale is equal to use state, and this will default to navigator. Actually, we don't want to default this to navigator language. We kind of want to do the same thing that we did in the index file. So we're going to grab this and we are going to paste it here. So now what happens is we can go ahead and say that the locale is equal to local, which I've just realized I've spelled that as local and not locale. So yeah, there's that. And now what we can do is we can go ahead and say const messages and set messages, right? So basically, I want to have the ability to default to the user's locale that's set from within their browser, and then based on that, I want to have the messages get set to the correct language. So that's why I still want to have, so just like I have this if check here, I want to do the same thing here. I want to default it to the correct language of that particular user. So what I'll say is I'll say the use state, the messages will be equal to the ling, because the ling is based on the locale that we get out of the user's browser. So once we have that basically set up, now what we can do is we can say messages is equal to our messages, and locale is equal to our, locale. Okay, great. So now what we need to do is we have to actually create a change handler that's going to get used in the app. In other words, wherever we're going to decide to actually build this component that's going to allow us to choose different languages, it's effectively going to have to call back up into this component to kind of change the state so that the locale and the messages can change accordingly. I realize that I'm using the wrong variable. This needs to be the locale variable, not the local variable, so that it's actually my state. And now we have to create this actual change handler function. So function, we're going to call this select ling. This will accept an event as an argument, and then we'll say const new locale is equal to e.target.value, right? And so now what we'll say, we're going to go ahead and say set locale is equal to new locale. And now, based on what this new locale is, we're going to want to decide what the languages are that we're going to set. So we're going to say if new locale is equal to es-mx. In other words, if we're trying to choose the Spanish, because again, that's what we offer, then we're going to go ahead and say set messages to be equal to Spanish. Otherwise, because again, I'm only offering two languages, so I can have a simple if-else. Otherwise, set messages will be equal to English. Now, one quick note I want to make, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but if you're familiar with code splitting, this might be a good time to actually use code splitting, because as you can imagine, if you're trying to offer more than just two languages, like say 5 or 6 or 7 languages, it kind of doesn't make sense to import all of them if you're only going to be using like one at a time. So what I would actually do is I would not make these static imports. I would dynamically import the language based on the locale that was chosen. But again, that assumes that you're familiar with code splitting. If you're not, don't worry about that. It's totally not relevant to the scope of this video. So don't get bogged down on that if you don't understand what I just said. Totally cool. Anyways, next step is to actually wrap our entire component here in the context.provider. So we can actually pass some values down. Whoops. Context.provider. Grab these guys. Wrap them in the provider. Okay, so now I actually want to pass down two things. So in value, we're going to create an object. The first thing is we're going to be passing down the locale. And then the second thing is we're going to be saying the set locale or the set language function, which is not coming up in my IntelliSense for some reason. Not quite sure why. All right, so there we go. Okay, so once we have that done, let's actually export this wrapper, and now we can go ahead and use it. So export default. Okay, so before we actually wire up the dropdown in the app component, let's first go back to the index component and make sure that we at least come back to the point where nothing's broken when we start wrapping our app with our wrapper components. Let's get rid of these language imports here. Let's get rid of all of this. Now let's import the wrapper. So import wrapper, whoops, from /components/wrapper, and then let's do this. Wrapper, this is going to have the app in it. Now just because the app depends on this, otherwise it may break, let's just pass a date into it, and that's going to be equal to date.now. Okay, so let's just run the app, see that we are still working, and it isn't working. Oh yeah, okay. These imports now need to go to ... because we are nested in one folder further. And there we go. So we're kind of back to working order, but of course we don't have any translations right now because everything is, well, we do kind of have the translations. It is getting powered by the file that we have. But in other words, by the language file, but it's all in English. So we don't actually see whether or not things are working, right? Because for me, it would have been English anyway, given the fact that my locale is the US. So let's actually see about wiring up this dropdown to see that we can actually change it between different languages and just kind of have the words and the date change on the fly. So let's do that. So what we need to do now is we're going to actually import the use context hook, which is a really nifty hook. This is one of my favorite ones, honestly. It makes working with context so much easier. I've also just realized that in my wrapper components, I should be exporting context here. So we need to export this. Now we need to come over here. Let's go ahead and import it. Import from /components/wrapper. Let's grab the context. Okay. Now, right over here, we're going to make a local variable called const_context is equal to use context, passing in the uppercase context variable. So this will basically extract the values out of it. And now right here under the image, I can go ahead and create my select. And I can go ahead and say that the value of this select is equal to context dot, what was it? I think it was .locale. Let me just double check what it was called. It was equal to .locale, yep. And then for the change handler on change, that's going to be equal to context dot, let me just go ahead and see really quickly. That's going to be equal to context dot setLang. Let me grab that and let me paste it in right over there. Okay, cool. So now that's done. Let's go ahead and create two options. So the first one is going to be for English. And then the value is going to be equal to en-us. And then the second one is going to be for Spanish. Let's change that to say Spanish. And then here we're going to go ahead and say, I think that this is es-mx. And let's save that, save the unsaved changes there, and let's see if this works. So right now it's set to English. We change this to be Spanish, and everything changes to Spanish. We come back and change it to English, and everything is back to English now. Well, that does it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please drop a like, subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.